Welcome back to The Discoverers. This is the home stretch. We have 4 chapters left to go, and if you are a CC Challenge 4 student or director, I know you're getting really excited that the end is in sight. This is Chapter 79, A Science of Culture. The next grand opening for the European view of civilization was accomplished by another amateur who also found his first clues in the New World. Edward Burnett Tylor, 1832 to 1917, had the advantage of being an outsider in other senses, too. Son of a Quaker brass founder in London, the young Tylor did not attend a public school, but instead was sent to a Quaker school. At 16, he went into the family business. Anyway, as a dissenter, he could not have been admitted to the university. So his Quaker inheritance saved him from defining quote-unquote culture as the peculiar product of the Greek and Roman classics and the established church. The Quaker suspicion of the fine arts saved him, too, from confining quote-unquote culture in the Victorian mold of Matthew Arnold. When he became the first professor of anthropology in Oxford in 1896, he would boast that he had never sat for an examination. At the age of 23, he seemed to be suffering from tuberculosis, and his family sent him traveling for his health. Instead of taking the grand tour of the capitals of Europe, which was customary for well-to-do young men in 1835, he went off to America. Vagabonding in Cuba, while on an omnibus in Havana, he fell into conversation with a fellow traveler, Henry Christie, a wealthy English banker in his 50s, who also happened to be a Quaker. Christie had already pursued his antiquarian interests in the East and Scandinavia and was just beginning an American excursion. For Quakers, ethnology and the ways of remote peoples had an ethical significance, documenting human brotherhood and supporting the anti-slavery impulse. They hoped to enlist anthropology to support Las Casas. This was not an easy task. In the European West, the words and ideas describing man's social achievements had acquired a eulogistic and self-regarding meaning. Culture, quote-unquote, from Latin cultus for worship, originally meant reverential homage. Then it came to describe the practice of cultivating the soil, and later it was extended to the cultivating and refinement of mind and manners. Finally, by the 19th century, culture had become a name for the intellectual and aesthetic side of civilization. So Wordsworth deplored any life, quote, where grace of culture hath been utterly unknown, end of quote. In Matthew Arnold's familiar phrase, culture was, quote, the acquainting ourselves with the best that has been known and said in the world, end of quote. This was a most unpromising name for an uncondescending scientific study of all human societies, but Tylor seized on the word and did wonders to empty it of chauvinistic and provincial overtones. For his success in this, and in making culture a neutral term and the focus of a new social science, he is generally agreed to be the founder of modern cultural anthropology. In his own time, it was called Mr. Tylor's Science. Tylor named his lifelong effort the science of culture, quote, to escape from the regions of transcendental philosophy and theology, to start on a more hopeful journey over more practicable grounds, end of quote. He needed courage to foray into the sacred groves as he did in his epic-making Primitive Culture. Quote, the world at large is scarcely prepared to accept the general study of human life as a branch of natural science, and to carry out in a large sense the poet's injunction to, quote, account for moral as for natural things, end of quote. To many educated minds, there seems something presumptuous and repulsive in the view that the history of mankind is part and parcel of the history of nature, that our thoughts, wills, and actions accord with laws as definite as those which govern the motion of waves, the combination of acids and bases, and the growth of plants and animals, end of quote. The subject of this natural history of society would be culture, redefined as, quote, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society." End of quote. Tyler noted that so many eminent thinkers had, quote, "brought history only to the threshold of science. If the field of inquiry be narrowed from history as a whole to that branch of it, which is here called culture, the history, not of tribes or nations, but of the condition of knowledge, religion, art, custom, and the like among them, the task of investigation proves to lie within far more moderate compass." End of quote. His first casual hint of these opportunities came to him as a young man in Mexico, when Christie took him to the ancient obsidian mines. The handy-worked obsidian prisms found here had formerly been described as maces or handles for weapons, but Tyler showed them to be the cores from which long knife-like flakes had been struck for weapons and tools. Intrigued by this remarkable, unfamiliar technology, he was on his way to making the study of technology necessary for the study of society. Adopting the Italian proverb, quote, "all the world is one country," end of quote, Tyler delighted in the correspondence between the ways of widely separated peoples. He avoided the plural word, cultures, and preferred the grand singular, culture, that's with a capital C. For example, he saw, quote, "scarce a hand's breadth difference," end of quote, between an English plowman using his hatchet and hoe, boiling his food over a log fire, hearing tales of a ghost in a nearby haunted house, and the similar ways of the Negro in Central Africa. Following Linnaeus's example, he set out a taxonomy of society. Quote, "To the ethnographer, the bow and arrow is a species. The habit of flattening children's skulls is a species. The practice of reckoning numbers by tens is a species. The geographical distribution of these things and their transmission from region to region have to be studied as the naturalist studies the geography of his botanical and zoological species. Just as the catalog of all the species of plants and animals of a district represents its flora and fauna, so the list of all the items of the general life of a people represents that whole which we call its culture." End of quote. Instead of digging, like Winckelmann and Schliemann, in classical ruins, or like Thompson in Warsaw, sifting the kitchen middens, devotees of this new science of culture would discover the past in the ways of living peoples. Tyler's invention was wonderfully simple. To help us, quote, "trace the course which the civilization of the world has actually followed," end of quote, he created a new archaeology of society with his notion of survivals. These are processes, customs, opinions, and so forth, which have been carried on by force of habit into a new state of society different from that in which they had in their original home. And they thus remain as proofs and examples of an older condition of culture out of which a newer has been evolved. The old Somersetshire woman who still used a hand loom, inherited from the days before the flying shuttle, and still threw her shuttle from hand to hand, was not, quote, "a century behind the times," end of quote, but simply a case of survival. These are, quote, "landmarks in the course of culture," end of quote. Quote, "when a custom, an art, or an opinion is fairly started in the world, disturbing influences may long affect it so slightly that it may keep its course from generation to generation, as a stream once settled in its bed will flow on for ages. This is a mere permanence of culture, and the special wonder about it is that the change and revolution of human affairs should have left so many of its feeblest rivulets to run so long," end of quote. Sometimes survival passed into revival, as in the case of modern spiritualism. According to Tyler, civilization advanced as much by abandoning the old as by introducing the new. And there we'll pause for the end of part 1.